Hey folks, I'm going to take you along with me as I go through my history of woes of the interface worlds in audio land and why I ended up with a Focusrite Red Line 16. If you're interested in coming along this journey with me, hang around for a little while. If you want to just skip ahead and you want to learn a little bit more about the Focusrite, click this point right here. I'll put a timestamp and you can go check out where I finally ended up. But to begin, I started this journey coming out of college where I get myself an Apollo 8. I got myself this Apollo 8 used. It was 2017, but I bought the first generation, which came out in 2012 or so thereabouts. It was a silver face. It had Firewire 800, which at the time is what my computer had, so it's what I needed. And then down the line, I upgraded. You could buy the little card from UAD that was Thunderbolt. So that was great. I was happy with that. And it was fine. I think at this point, there's so much content online about what a UAD Apollo does. I'm not going to get into that. It was great for me. It got me into UAD plugins. It was fine. But I wasn't crazy about how it sounded. To me, the conversion just kind of sounded anemic. The highs were unimpressive. The lows lacked depth and character. And this was compounded by the fact that I've started to use some outboard gear in my mixes. So, as much as I didn't like that conversion coming out just to my monitors, I liked it even less going out of the interface, using my hardware, and coming back into my interface using that conversion again. So, if it was just my monitors, that would be one thing, but what made me really realize that this is something that bothered me is when a buddy of mine had the same piece of outboard gear that I had in my studio, and he had a newer interface, and it sounded way better in his system. And it wasn't just his monitoring, because I'd been in his room a bunch of times. The piece of hardware sounded better just from the generational leap of where conversion has gotten us. So I found myself on a quest for new conversion, and in that, a new interface. Also, my outboard rack had started to grow, and I'd started to outgrow the just raw number of inputs and outputs on my interface. So it was time. So I set myself a couple goals of what I wanted out of this interface. Number one, it has to have notably good sounding conversion. This is a tough one because it's very subjective, and it's not like you can just kind of raw test what a converter sounds like, throw it up on YouTube and say, listen to this, because then you're listening back to an iPhone, and you're listening to an iPhone speaker or headphones, and that's kind of out of the water. So without testing every single one of these in my situation, I'm going to have to take somebody's word on how good or bad something sounds. And I was okay with that. What I was looking for is reviews and reviewers that I trusted online or in print who went out of their way to note how good the conversion sounded. So, sound quality, tick box, number one. I wanted more than 8 analog inputs and outputs. Like I said, my outboard gear collection isn't massive now, but it's growing, and 8 was already starting to kind of put a cramp on what I wanted to do in my hybrid mix workflow. So more than 8, and as audio people tend to work in banks of 8, probably 16. More better, but probably looking at 16 analog inputs and outputs. I knew I probably wanted something that had Thunderbolt, just because the limitations of USB and just how much throughput I was going to put on my audio bus. I mean, Thunderbolt is the way of the future. It's the way of the present. All the computers I work with at this point have Thunderbolt. I knew that I could leverage the throughput of the Thunderbolt bus. USB would probably have been fine, but why not take advantage of the Thunderbolt ports that I have on all my computers? If I found something that was Ethernet driven, like a fully digital IP solution, that would have been fine, but probably looking in the Thunderbolt series of interfaces. I knew one thing I was not looking for were a ton of preamps. What I do in this space is mixing. I'm not doing a lot of tracking, so I really just needed analog line in and line outs. So finding something that wasn't just loaded up with a bunch of preamps was kind of a tough find. Of course, it can't cost a fortune. The sky is the limit when you want premium conversion, and you could spend tens of thousands, if not more, by getting a completely custom situation. But so price was a factor, but I had some budget to work with, and I think I've ended up somewhere that I'm really happy with. I did want something that could eventually do Atmos, something that could eventually handle multi-channel outputs and immersive sound functionality monitoring for down the road. I'm not there yet. There's space in this room to maybe do that one day, but that was in the back of my head, maybe lower priority, but I wanted something that could handle Atmos if I really wanted to. And also, this thing had to be reliable. I thought that was kind of my base level thing, that I just turn it on and it works every single time. One, the UAD Apollo did that great. You turn it on, the thing just works. And I thought that's the way that most things were going to work. I found out otherwise. So my first stop after deciding that I wanted to do something besides the Apollo was the Antelope Orion 32 Plus Gen 4. It's a mouthful. So it's the new interface coming out from Antelope. It's USB-C or Thunderbolt. You have some channel limitations when you go down to USB, but with a Thunderbolt cable, you have kind of access to the whole thing. What I was really excited about this is that Antelope has a long history of great sounding conversion. They've been doing mastering grade clocks and converters for a long time, so I figured that was a good place to start. The Orion 32 Plus, that 32 corresponds to 32 analog inputs and outputs, all on D subs. Another qualification I'd really like in an interface were the line inputs and outputs on D sub connectors, also known as DB25 connectors. It's basically 8 channels of analog audio over one connector, and what that lets you do is not a whole lot more than space saving, and it lets you do really clean cable management, especially if down the road I wanted to do a patch bay, which I can now tell you I've done. So it's just D sub to D sub, DB25, DB25, big kind of chunky multi-pin cables to just do more in analog inputs and outputs over fewer cables. So the back of the rack looks really nice, it's really clean, and coming from the live world, I like multi-pin connectors, just big chunks of cables going either direction. So the Antelope Orion had all their inputs and outputs on D subs, which was great. And the conversion, I had been told or was led to believe, was great. And it has lots of Atmos multi-channel playback functionality, at least ready, maybe not off the bat. And the price was right. I mean, for that much analog inputs and outputs, I was thinking like, dang, this is a deal. So I grabbed one. So after it arrived, the problems started pretty quickly. I had some really terrible problems getting my device authorized as a new Antelope user. The customer-facing, user-facing websites and kind of the back end is horrible. The websites and the support system is awful. And it's like a couple different pages that all do something similar but not quite the same, and it's just this maze of which very similar looking page am I looking at or not. So eventually they got it registered to me and I plugged it all up, and that's fine. So then you get the control software for the Orion 32 Plus Gen 4. And at the time of recording this on their page, the Gen 4 is hard to find. The Gen 3 is right there. The Gen 3 is right there. The Synergy Core is there. The the Galaxy 32 is there. The Galaxy 64 is there. But finding exactly the interface that I had was way more trouble than it should have been for their brand new box, prominently featured on their website for sale. So that was a little bit of a red flag. Eventually, I got the drivers. Eventually. And eventually I got the software to control it to work. Eventually. I finally figured out how their patching system works, which was nice, and it's very pretty, and there's lots of colors, and it's very customizable. And I plugged up some hardware, and I plugged in my monitors, and it worked. And it sounded great, and the conversion was great. I felt like, sorry to beat a dead analogy, but, you know, a blanket was taken off my monitors, and I was really happy with it. And I worked for a little while, and things were going great. I was like, cool, I'm an Antelope guy, and this is cool. And then out of nowhere, I started getting, like, noise. And it wasn't just the typical, like, just hold your phone up next to a monitor and you kind of get some RF interference. It was way more irregular than that. So I had to get in contact with Antelope support. And I made a video about it. And it was not impressive. Several times I was on the line with support for over an hour, and then my phone call would just get disconnected. And their support, I'm pretty sure, is just one guy. Bless his heart. Eventually, support ticket goes through, and they tell me to downgrade the drivers to the previous version of their drivers for their interfaces. It was an extremely convoluted process. Eventually it worked and the noise went away. So some time passed, and eventually there actually was an update to the latest generation of drivers. So I was like, cool, maybe they fixed this problem. Downloaded it, installed it. It took a while. It was fine. The noise was gone for maybe 2 hours of working. And then this clicking noise was back. And I couldn't get rid of it. And there's this whole rigmarole to make the drivers available to me because it required a special link to find the drivers. And meanwhile, having the actual device talk to your computer through their software of how their drivers work was a total crapshoot. I could have summarized all of this by saying the hardware is great. The software that makes the hardware talk to your computer is trash. It made the hardware completely unusable, which for such a great piece of hardware at such a great price point, I mean, that was a real bummer. It was just the software that got in the way. And listen, I'm a computer guy. I'm a nerd. I'm happy to sit there and troubleshoot stuff for many, many hours, but it just wasn't worth it. Stuff just wasn't getting done. And at one point, I had to go use some little pocket interface I have stashed in a Pelican that I normally just use on the road in emergencies. That had to become my main one because this brand new Antelope box just wasn't working. Another fairly unimpressive thing about the Antelope box, not a single headphone amp. So plenty of analog inputs and outputs. That wasn't the problem. But they didn't want to put a headphone output on it. Inconvenient. Especially when you're trying to make an Atmos ready box, because the binaural renderer is part of that process. So I had got out and bought a headphone output thinking that that was going to be the box, but ended up not. So I'm on my search again, and I said, okay, I need to get something from a brand that I know has reputable software, from a brand that I know sells a lot of these things, from a brand that I preferably have first-hand experience using, because I'm not about to let software get in the way of my workflow again. Focusrite has pro stuff. Like, really good pro stuff. Of course, we can talk endlessly about the ISA console, arguably the best sounding console ever made, but like, Focusrite's legit. I know they make a lot of money at this point selling lots of very cheap interfaces, and they're almost kind of a meme joke in the recording world. Like, oh, you've got another Scarlett, or you've got another 2i2 little baby interface. But the fact is that guys who are just getting their start in recording plug it into their computer, and it works solidly every time. Another reason I know that Focusrite does some really legitimate high-end product is that, again, I come from the live world, and RedNet is all over the place. Basically, RedNet is Dante with a hint of Focusrite. It's basically Dante networking protocols that you can use with Focusrite gear and through Focusrite controllers. And when coupled with analog inputs and outputs, or analog conversion, it's Focusrite conversion with Dante networking, which sounds great to me. I see guys build their live racks with tons of outboard gear, and they use Focusrite RedNet stuff all the time. So I knew it was reliable because it's reliable enough to put it on an arena tour. I knew that it's Dante. I have Dante certifications. I have RedNet certifications. I know what the software looks like, and I know that it's really, really well thought out. And then I found this box, and I'm super happy with it. So I ended up with the Focusrite Red Line 16. It's somewhat different from the RedNet line of interfaces because it's not just Dante. It is more supposed to be an all-in-one, all-inclusive audio interface for recording. So, the Focusrite Red Line 16 has 16 line inputs and outputs on D-subs. It's got 2 extra TRS monitor outputs. The conversion is fantastic. I read some Sound on Sound reviews on it many years ago, and they still sound great. That hasn't changed. Plus, it has Dante, which, again, I know, I love. I can if I want to use this in my live rig, I can. And it's just a protocol that I'm comfortable with and that I'm confident in, which gives me good feelings. So, it arrived. I had a really great deal worked out with a retailer out on the West Coast. It's gorgeous. It can talk directly to Pro Tools HDX card, which I don't have, but that's kind of cool. Thunderbolt, analog I/O on D-subs. The software has been absolutely untouchable. The conversion sounds fantastic. My outboard gear sounds great. My monitors sound great. I'm just really happy with the thing. Just really quickly, this is the RedNet control software. It looks a little bit maze-ish right now, but it's actually really, really simple to break down. These are all of your inputs and outputs. You can see I'm actually using this number 1 mic pre with an SM7. So yeah, it's all the way cranked, but again, I'm like 3 feet away from this SM7 and it's plenty. So we've got all of our Dante inputs and outputs. We have our ADAT inputs and outputs. We have all of our analog in and out. I can change this to either be a microphone, instrument, or line input. We have a couple monitoring things, which I'll come back to. All of our routing is totally customizable, however you want to have it work for you. And then these custom mixes. So like, I can have the second headphone output on B. On mix B, be a different mix from mix A. And it's just really simple to work around. This, knock on wood, has never crashed. It's never let me down. It's just a really well thought out piece of software, and they update it regularly. So can't ask for much more there. My only qualms with the Focusrite Red Line 16 are mostly in the realm of monitoring. So at this point, without their dedicated Dante-controlled monitor controller, there's no good way to have a second set of monitors. It's just not a feature they built into it. And I find that pretty disappointing, if I'm honest. Like, that is on their boxes that cost half as much. On like the Scarlett 18i20, there's an alt monitor section, and they didn't build one into the Red Line 16. It's a $4,000 box. That's kind of cutting some corners, if you ask me. Another one that's kind of along the same lines, but I wish there was a better way to do this, is I'm getting some monitors arriving soon that I can drive AES or digitally. One, there's no AES ports out the back. That's fine. There's a lot of boxes that don't have AES. That's not my gripe. What I'm concerned with is that I can't send just a Dante stream out and control it with my volume knob. So even if I got like a Dante Avio, which is just Dante in one end and then just converts it to AES, I can't control those Dante outputs with my volume knob, which is kind of a bummer. And I understand that as you decrease your volume, you're going to lose some bit depth, and we can go down that pathway. But I reached out to Focusrite and said, is there a way to do this? And they said, yeah, you just have to buy our $1,200 controller. So it's a functionality that this interface can do, but I need a controller, a volume knob, to tell it to do it. Really? And lastly, I'm still a little bit confused about this, but at present time, it sounds like the maximum Atmos control that this can do is 714, which is honestly as much as I think I'd be able to fit in this room, so I'm not concerned about this. But I know people are going to want to be doing the full Atmos 916, and that's kind of a bummer. We have all these Dante outputs. Why can't we figure out a way to control a 916 room? Along the Atmos control lines, there is no real monitor controlling. There's no way to dim certain speaker channels. There's no way to delay or EQ any speaker channels. So you're really looking at either doing it with another piece of software or with another piece of hardware if you're trying to really monitor an Atmos rig straight from the Line 16. But for right now, in my hybrid stereo workflow, this box is great. I'm really happy. It turns on every single time. It talks to my computer immediately. The drivers are rock solid. My outboard sounds great and I have room to grow. I'm really happy with it. I'm bummed that it took me so long to get here and that companies are still putting out pieces of gear that just aren't followed up with on their software side. But here we are. I'm happy, and I'm a Focusrite guy. So reach me out in the comments if you have any other questions about the gear that I've either had or have now, or if you want to see a particular function, I can try to demo it for you, and, happy hunting. It's basically one multi-pin port that's 8 channels of analog audio. Really? The other reason I knew that Focusrite does some really high-end stuff is, again, I'm kind of coming from the live world. So the red... I've got to turn that off. P.S. Merch available in the store, ifitsoundsgood.com.